Good evening, and thank you for joining our programming tonight. My name is Caleb Cyan. I'm the founder of Textiles and the organizer of Portland Textile X Month and the co-founder of Textile Hive, which you see behind me. Textile X and the Portland Textile X Month Festival are part of a social enterprise founded and organized by Textile Hive to build community and foster cross-pollination among textile enthusiasts, artists, businesses, schools, and cultural organizations. We create programming and provide an open platform to share histories, knowledge, commerce, experiences, and practices across cultures and generations. We seek to partner with facilitators and organizations rooted in community building, sharing, accessibility, inclusivity, diversity, and collaboration. By creating and fostering textile programming that champions grassroots collaboration and dialogue, we create meaningful opportunities for change. Tonight's programming is co-presented by the AC+D program. Connecting the head, hand, and heart, the MFA and Applied Craft and Design program is grounded in hands-on making, entrepreneurial strategies, and social and environmental engagement. The program empowers students to become critical thinkers and makers of culture who prioritize ethical, social, and environmental responsibilities in relation to profit in creative economies. The MFA and Applied Craft and Design welcomes students from a wide range of creative backgrounds to make original work with an applied purpose. Before we start our presentation, I'd like to share our land acknowledgement. Portland Textile X Month and PNCA acknowledges that what we now call Portland, Oregon, and Multnomah County are located on the ancestral lands of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Cowlitz, Panzo, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia and Willamette rivers. We are on this land because of the forced relocation, genocide, assimilation of its traditional peoples by colonists and settlers. As settlers and our guests, we recognize the strong and diverse Native communities in our region today from tribes both local and distant, and offer respect and gratitude for their stewardship of these lands past, present, and future. We'd like to also acknowledge and celebrate the role Native communities have had and continue to hold within the field of textiles. Tonight's lecture is part of PNCA's Haley Ford School of Graduate Studies lecture series and is sponsored by the MFA and Applied Craft and Design program in Portland Textile X Month. I'd like to thank Sarah Houston for all of her help organizing and bringing this event to life. The Textile X Conversation series brings together two contemporary textile artists to discuss their work and practices in relation to the theme of new traditions. New traditions begs the question, in these rapidly changing times, what do we preserve and build upon, and what do we rethink and rebuild anew? These conversations ask participating artists and audiences how they can transform their textile practices to serve a more inclusive, equitable, sustainable, and connected purpose. This week's conversation is between Jovencio de la Paz and Sonya Dahl. Jovencio de la Paz is an artist, weaver, and educator. Their work explores the intersecting histories of weaving and modern computers, rhyming across millennia, the stories of weaving and computation unfold as a space of speculation, trained in traditional processes of weaving, dye, and stitch work, but reveling in the complexities and contradictions of digital culture. De la Paz works to find relationships between concerns of language, embodiment, pattern, and code with broad concerns of ancient technology, speculative future, and the phenomenon of emergence. Jovencio is currently assistant professor and curricular head of fibers at the University of Oregon. Sonya Dahl is an artist, writer, lecturer of contemporary art at the University of Oregon. Her work critically explores cultural, historic, metaphoric, and embodied aspects of how textile processes such as indigo dyeing, whitework embroidery, and patchwork quilting live within and reflect the values of human society. She conducts her research and art making from a situated acknowledgement and critical engagement with her white American settler identity. She is a founding member of craft mystery cult a member of Ditch Project's Artist Run Space in Springfield, Oregon, and a continuing collaborator with Babaran Sagoran Cultural House in Jakarta, Indonesia. Her arts research projects and subsequent collaborations in Indonesia are supported by the Fulbright Foundation and the Asian Cultural Council. Sonya's work has been exhibited nationally, internationally, and her writing is published in peer-reviewed journals and printed on online publications. Please help me give a warm welcome to Jovencio de la Paz and Sonya Dahl.
We kind of began our conversation about this conversation, of course, from the standpoint of the theme for the Portland Textile Month of New Traditions, which is this sort of lovely broad theme that's embedded with all kinds of potential meanings. But the word that, Jovencio, you brought to me when we were first starting to talk about this conversation was the word worlding, as maybe one way of thinking about, new traditions, but also maybe in a sort of broader way. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind kind of starting us off and tell me a little bit more about what you think about this worlding.
Yeah,
idea.
The subject of new traditions, I think, struck me in a number of ways. It's a very decisive kind of language. It implies, of course, the existence of old traditions, but also this notion that those traditions are somehow static or locked in the past. They're old, so they're there, trapped in the past. And so much of our work collaboratively and research we've done has had to do with the notion of speculation and speculative future. For myself, as a weaver, trained in very ancient kind of process of weaving, that has occupied such a big part of my work as an artist. But simultaneously, I work really directly with digital platforms, so coding and software. There's a very rich history between the weaving loom and the modern computer, as many of you might know. So I'm always in this conundrum of sort of like old tradition, new tradition. What is the relationship there? Meanwhile, interest, just as sort of a cultural consumer, is in science fiction. The works of Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler, and then many others. I tend to triangulate my practice there. And so this word, worlding, actually I borrow from science fiction, speculative fiction, which suggests a kind of ability of the artist or ability of an individual to imagine a world. And so just in a very basic way, I think that notion of imagination or imagining a world has so much to do with the project of new traditions, right? It suggests a possibility that, that there's importance in the speculation of other, alternative futures, alternative narratives to the one that we occupy now. And so in a very open kind of way, that I brought this word to Sonya because actually I think a very recent body of work, which was also engaged in, I don't want to misrepresent that work, but in mythology, in legend, in the sort of alternative world of mythos. And so it seems like a natural, or it seems like a very fruitful place for us to speak.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're interested in science fiction. I mean, I, like many people, is this better? Okay. Of course, like many people during the pandemic, I found myself just sort of naturally diving back into some of my sort of favorite science fiction writing. So of course, like I reread the Earthsea series by Ursula K. Le Guin and Philip Pullman's, his Dark Materials, and all these different stories. So yeah, and I think part of that may have been inspired by you talking about the influence of science fiction on some of your weavings, and starting to think more about that sort of relationship between myth and story and the actual making of cloth. As many of us, I'm sure, in this room know, cloth itself, textiles are some of the, not to get on a high horse or anything, but I think some of the most metaphorically rich kind of material culture that we have to draw on as humans, for probably so many different reasons, And so, yeah, this question of worlding, of new traditions as they relate to textiles, I think is, it's really natural, but also I think very fruitful, especially considering the kind of moment that we're in as a field, and this emphasis on shifting, some of the basic structures of the field, some of the ways that textiles have been studied anthropologically, and power dynamics and those kinds of things. So yeah, for sure, it makes a lot of sense that we're in this moment of thinking about not only traditions, but how to make them new, how to grow them, how to adapt. But one of the things that's, one more thought, one of the things that is interesting to me in thinking about worlding, this sort of like this utopian drive, this like you said, speculative, but in many ways, we can't speculate from an unembedded place. Like we are kind of coming to these conversations and these ideas from a place of embeddedness, and I think that's something really fruitful as well.
Yeah, I think that I'm glad you bring up kind of a pandemic narrative. In so many ways, there's a subtle line in this word worlding that, I think there's a reason that science fiction, fantasy narratives have seen kind of an explosion of population. It's also like escapism, right? Like there's a quality that, there's a kind of numbing effect that these kinds of narratives can have. They bring us away from the urgencies of quote unquote, the real world. But I think that's very valid. I think we'll come back to that point probably. It'll be natural for us to come back to that. But I think that in another way, what is interesting to me about this word is sort of the way in which it references, I think, simultaneously a very intimate and personal endeavor, which is like, I want to imagine a better world for myself and my loved ones. Very intimate. At the same time, it can be projected out into the expanse of like creating a world, right? An imaginary world, but nonetheless a world. And I think about myself, my own experience becoming an artist. As you know, I immigrated to the U.S. from Southeast Asia. I was very young, but moving from like very urban, highly populous Southeast Asia to rural Oregon was very shocking. And as like a person of color and like a fledgling queer, it was a very violent place, right? So the present world of rural Oregon was scary to me. And so I started like looking into science fiction. Like I spent a lot of time on the computer and like reading science fiction because I needed other worlds, I'm sure lots of people have had this experience, but it's sort of like, oh yeah, the computer, in fantasy and in science fiction, I think a lot of queer people of color and queer people find their first communities through these kinds of subcultures, right? So anyway, I say that only because I think in that possibility of survival through speculation, through speculative futures, something really magical can happen. And that embeddedness, right? It's sort of like we always begin in the world we're in, right? And so when you look at Octavia Butler, when you look at these writers who are looking at histories of slavery, histories of colonialism, it's sort of like, oh, let me imagine from that place a different trajectory and present a kind of ecosystem, a world, right, that is supportive of that other vision. I think it's so important. I just watched Dune, which is like, it was, it's great. It's like amazing, cinematography and feat. But I am very sensitive also to like who is in control of the tool of imagining, right? So like when you look at a lot of science fiction, these utopic visions, they tend to be dreamt of by specific embodiments, male, hetero, white, European. These are the folks with the tools to imagine these futures. And so do we divert that, right? This question of worlding is like, how do we bring the tools of speculation? How do we encourage these narratives to come from a more diverse, a larger kind of global perspective?
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, is this better?
This too? Okay. Okay. Those of you in the room, prepare to be blown away. It's gonna be a rock concert. Yeah, hopefully this works out a little bit better, but keep us posted. Of course. Sounds good. 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 Kind of drawing on what you were just saying, I think, yeah. Similarly, I've been thinking a lot about how this idea of worlding is, it implies something is in a state of becoming that isn't yet. And what I love about it is that it's an open enough terminology that that it can encompass something very broad, like worlding as in building a new world for the fiber arts or for the field of textile studies, that there's something new that needs to happen. Again, kind of touching on this new traditions idea, but that a world can also be, like you said, a single person, a single embodied experience. And that worlding is something that can happen in as intimate a space as that, as one's own life and experiences, And that world, that the sort of that tiny seed can then go out into the broader world and kind of take part in that larger process. And yeah, in terms of like textiles, which is ostensibly what we're here for, and which is where, so much of our work is rooted. That looks amazing, large. I mean, I definitely feel my experiences in the field of kind of textile studies from the standpoint of being a maker, from being a researcher, from being a writer, and you have done all these things as well, that there is this sense of urgency in the broader field that change is necessary and that it's very awkward and slow coming. But maybe, yeah, we can talk a little bit about what does worlding have to do with the field of textiles, the field of fibers, and what worlds are becoming from that field, from the standpoint of woven cloth, the warp and weft, the sort of very primary structure. I think a lot about how those intertwining threads are a world in themselves, and that the spaces between the threads are worlds in themselves, and that from that sort of very primary structure, like a physical structure, so much can be built both metaphorically and physically.
Yeah, there's so much in what you've just said. I'm trying to pick out specific sort of trajectories, but I'm very interested in what you described in sort of the we both go on conference circuits, and we get to see kind of various institutions, organizations, sort of the platform that is set for the discussion of art and textiles in academia. And so I think we have lots of opinions about that, but I don't want to get too far away from your question. I think that, we study textile, and I think that art practice and the word textile is going to be interchangeable in what I'm saying here. I think we tend to forget that the platform of the institution of academic kind of learning of textile is a specific world that has been constructed, right? And actually the older history of the learning and thinking through textile is much broader than sort of a Western tradition of academia. But that's where we're situated. And, of course, institution always presents itself as much larger. It's one of its endeavors is to present itself as much larger than it actually is. So I think I see many of my own students, grad students, other colleagues feel, in the last decade, especially very trapped by a kind of institution that feels like the whole world. That it feels like, a particular art market, a particular academic institution that is everything, when it's so clearly not. And I think it's very obvious that young artists, students are dissatisfied with this sort of, I don't know, tell me if I'm right or wrong. There's a lot of dissatisfaction in sort of the markets or in the institutions as they're presented. And I think it's sort of, the endeavor has started to become like, we need a different set of a set of base circumstances from which to live as artists and makers. That worlding, I think, is part of that discussion. Like, we want a different set of circumstances to engage as textile, as makers of textile and makers of art. And I think textile is such a specific and excellent place for that discussion, because it has, cloth always has this ability to move between sort of the cognitive and the theoretic, and then the lived and embodied, or the public space of markets or the personal space of the domestic. So it can travel between these dimensions very fluidly. I think it always has, right? So I think it is ripe for that exploration. You know, I know students who equally sort of like engage gallery system in cloth, but also are very interested in making more sustainable choices by making their own products for themselves and for the use of those products in their homes. So I think that is part of the discussion we're having. It isn't limited, I think, only to institution or to it touches upon many realities which one individual tends to explore over the course of a life, you know. What do you think?
A lot of similar things, but I also think, I mean, what's so interesting about the process of worlding, of this process of sort of, you know, identifying that there's something we might not be satisfied with, or something doesn't sit right with the foundation doesn't feel stable, or something like that. So identifying that, whether it's within one's own life and practice, or within the larger field, or within the sort of academic structure that that we move through as students, as educators, but that there's something that happens in that that moment of deciding to pursue something different, that is so energetic and exciting and filled with purpose and so completely messy. I mean, it is like there is no roadmap. When you're worlding, you're making up the roadmap as you go, right? And sometimes that can be amazing, and sometimes that can be super messy and can create more problems than you knew that you were getting into. But there's something about that messiness that feels really fruitful. And I've been thinking, like, I've been reading this wonderful book by Jenny Odell that my sister gave me, How to Do Nothing. I think the subtitle is Resisting the Attention Economy. And it's this wonderful, basically sort of plea for and case for like returning to, or not returning, that's one of those worlding words that can get messy. But a sort of a plea for embodied experience, for a sort of sensual experience of, yes, we're all connected to these devices and we use them in various ways and they capture our attention. But we also are bodies in the world that have experiences, that can kind of take in the sensory elements of the world around us, that can develop relationships with the animals in our neighborhoods, or whatever the case might be. But she in this book is kind of going through and talking about some of the sort of utopian projects of the past, all of which sort of inevitably fail. But in that failure, sometimes lies the possibility for the next sort of worlding process to happen. And so I've been thinking about how this process of worlding, or this desire to change something for the better, that the path is not clear, and that failure is bound to be kind of woven into it. And that feels really fruitful and kind of exciting for me as well. So yeah, when we're thinking about, students or ourselves who are feeling sort of unsatisfied or desiring of a new direction, I think, thinking about, okay, well, what new directions are we going to go in and how are we going to go about it? That is also very exciting and interesting.
Yeah, well, they're both, I think, practical. There are practical matters in this conversation, and then there are very idealistic and esoteric and imaginative and theoretical. That's a false dichotomy, of course.
Right.
Like those two things are never, you can't separate them. But I think craft, textile, any sort of form of making that we might define as craft, whether that is like baking bread or weaving or throwing a pot, I think it's so ripe with sort of some practical suggestions for worlding, right? When you actually engage material in this physical way, you are engaging in sort of altering the physical reality of your direct world, but also perhaps your community, et cetera. So I think they're practical things, or practical sort of jumping off points. But I know that this conversation can get so theoretic and disembodied so quickly, but I think that what, and we're sort of halfway through the time, and I just want to keep an eye on that. But so yes, the crafts, these fields, textiles, ceramics, they're so poised through sort of physical manipulation to suggest that another world is possible. The possibility lies in that sort of enacting the creation of this object. But related to that, I think that something that is equally important is cultivating a kind of imaginative impulse that I think we're really in subtle and not so subtle ways, our consumer capitalist society really doesn't want us to engage, right? It's much better if you just consume. Is I think the sort of drumbeat that exists. And so imagining our way out of that, I think is, when I say worlding, I think that is sort of like, what are the skills that are required to imagine our way out of that? And I think that I always reference this text, The Knights of Labor by Jacques Rancière, which is sort of like, for a new world, for revolution to take place, it can't be like a unilateral, it can't be one field or one kind of person, right? Like the revolution requires artists, poets, requires lawyers and politicians and investment bankers, requires the proletariat, it requires all levels of society. But at each different level, right, I think the capacity to imagine, like just that is actually radical. Like we're really not encouraged to do that, when you are being fed algorithm after algorithm on Netflix or iTunes, right? You're being your world is being specified for you at increasing detail, right? And that's like the project of the anti-worlding, right?
Anti-worlding. That's another good one.
Do you feel like so much of your practice has been engaged in in travel and in sort of through the Fulbright? Is this something I think we tend to talk about we as like a very global, like assuming a kind of universalism, which is not true. I'm curious if from your experience in Southeast Asia and in Indonesia specifically, if you find this as an impulse elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, in some ways, and no in other ways, because I think, a lot of, we're definitely, we are coming to this idea of worlding from our own sort of intellectual contexts, being artists, educators embedded in the academy, in this particular place in the world, you know, coming from our various different backgrounds. So going to Indonesia for me, it was all about adaptation. So in many ways, I felt like I was carrying my very small, personal, fragile world and sort of hurling that into the broader world in this very tenuous way. So on a personal level, that time that I've spent over the years going back and forth to Indonesia and building relationships and projects there, of course, taught me far more about what it means to be the person that I am here, as an American citizen, as someone descended from immigrants, as, all of these specific locations of my own identity. Of course, whenever you take yourself out of your context, you have, a person can have these experiences. But in terms of like what you're asking about, this sort of project of worlding, or this desire for something new, in Indonesia, my experiences were really varied. I mean, in many ways, I went there to study about contemporary art as well as to study about textiles like indigo dyeing and batik and ikat weaving. And so I was moving through a lot of different types of communities and ways of making and ways of approaching and thinking about and actually physically engaging with materials that were oftentimes very much in conflict with each other, or at dichotomies with each other. And so those kinds of, the similar kinds of questions come up in those contexts as they do, say, in art school. But oftentimes the questions were really about how to regain something that had been lost. I found often that there is a lot of worlding going on among weavers and dyers and batik artists throughout Indonesia. But oftentimes that the building of new traditions was and continues to be sort of out of necessity, because through the sort of colonial project of the Dutch Empire and all the other colonizing powers that sort of really altered the course of history in Indonesia, and the course of material culture, introducing synthetic dyes and things like that, so that in very tangible ways, artisans are trying to build their traditions again from a place of loss. So there's a gap in knowledge. And so that, I think, is also a really potent thing, is to, is like to recognize that sometimes the project of worlding or of building new traditions is very much practical. It's a reconstruction, totally. Of what's been lost. Yeah.
It's sort of like the stages to me. Of course, when we talk about worlding, we're also talking about many different worlds that are sort of pressed up each other, which we tend to occupy simultaneously. But that it's impossible not to talk about sort of indigenous knowledge has been detoured, and because of colonizing, the project of colonization. And I think about so many of our students at the University of Oregon who come from the indigenous, who are first generation students who are there as representatives of sort of indigenous traditions and displaced peoples throughout North America. That this project of worlding is not about going back to like some zero point, but actually like, oh, these worlds were just detoured for centuries. And the project of imagining a different world is actually like, involves touching upon, as you're describing, traditions, knowledge of ancestral knowledge that is being sought after by descendants of living descendants of those traditions. And yeah, I think that often we tend to be we tend to oversimplify, I think, when we are dreaming about how things could be better, how things could be more equitable, how we can rebuild institution. We tend to think about it as like, okay, if we demolish everything and start over, that attitude is actually also is equally problematic, right? It's like you can't ever start over. You have to acknowledge sort of the inherited, that which is inherited, and build from there or towards that. Maybe we should open up to questions before we run out of time. I know that we've been talking a lot.
Okay. Sure. Yes. Oh, yes. For those of you online, just be aware, we are open to taking questions. We have someone here, Sarah is monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, you should feel free. Anyone in the room and in the great beyond world, you should really feel welcome to interject at any point. We can pause for a moment to see if anything comes in. But there's always so many things to say. Yes. Sure. Let me restate that so that those online can hear. So the question has been asked for us to talk about how the internet influences, flows into our work, how our work flows through the internet, sort of our relationships to that kind of digital space and digital technology. Is that a good recap? Okay.
The internet is
it's unavoidable.
It's unavoidable in so many ways, but I think that there are certain attitudes about it that are really important to acknowledge as contemporary artists, and specifically, I work a lot with digital spaces and with programming, and internet comes up frequently, as a practical tool. But I think just like any tool we use in the studio, it's worthy of very close analysis. So like, I think we were both raised in a material tradition that's like, if you're going to use indigo dye, you better know a little bit about its history, the narratives surrounding it, etc. Internet, I think we don't do that so readily. We sort of think of it as it's just sort of there and available. But I think one thing I think about a lot in my own work, which is about where the place where the digital and the physical meet each other. We have a fantasy of the digital that is like disembodied, which is very inaccurate, right? Like in Eastern Oregon, you can go see the internet, like Google's data centers and Facebook's data centers. You actually can't see them. They're very well guarded, but you can like go near them.
You can see it on Google Earth.
Yeah.
On the internet.
Yeah, it's a wild cycle. These tools, which are so embedded, in our lives, they have physical, embodied kind of repercussions. Whether you want to, you can think about it through fossil fuels, or they use massive amounts of air conditioning. Like the internet uses massive amount of creates carbon emissions. And so in my own work, I think about I try and cultivate a relationship with the tool of the internet in that way. It's sort of like to not have passive relationships with the internet, or with TikTok or Instagram or any of these other platforms, that they're very precise, specific tools, and cultivating a precise and specific relationship with them, I think makes us more responsible users and thus less passive sort of consumers. I don't know if you have a follow-up.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot, well, I mean, your work inspires me a great deal. And Stacy Jo Scott, who's our longtime collaborator as well, who does a lot of research about digital space and ceramics. But, thinking about the internet as a material, I think is so fascinating. I will say, just to answer your question personally, like, the internet, yeah, it's a tool. It's a really, really valuable research tool. I couldn't have written my proposal for the Fulbright grant to go to Indonesia without that research tool, without the internet, without the things that I could find there. So that's one thing about it. But I do think, one of the things that really interests me about it is, or about sort of digital worlds, is stems partially from my own sort of, I don't want to say dislike of, but I try to have clear boundaries. I don't enjoy spending time on computers. I enjoy different kinds of activities. I enjoy baking bread and weaving and embroidering and making things. And so but I think there's something interesting, again, about this sort of dichotomy of the material world and this idea of the sort of the digital space as this free, open space where anything can circulate. And to some degree that's true. But I'm really interested in this sort of narrative, the sort of utopian narratives that are kind of embedded in a lot of the ways that the Silicon Valley operates. And I come from the Silicon Valley. Like, my family's in San Jose. We moved to Cupertino when I was starting 7th grade, and it was awful. But so I have this sort of, through my own life of living in the Bay Area, I have this sort of relationship with the growth of this sort of digital space that's not everyone's experience. And yeah, I feel that was a pretty big ramble, but it's sort of like I like it, and I want to have clear boundaries with it. Yeah. Okay. Okay. That's a really good question. Is that available to everyone who's online, or should I give you the microphone to read that again? Okay.
Yeah, Sonia, did you have
catharsis? Can you read it again? It was so,
it's so beautifully
rich.
written.
It was really beautiful. I want to listen to it again.
I have a gut response to that. I love this question. My gut response is I feel like I don't have to, because apocalyptic narratives just abound in our culture. And so I can just turn on any, sci-fi network, any HBO, you just go through the sci-fi list, and there are so many people reflecting on worlds that are not better, I think, for the sake of catharsis. Like, it's a kind of like pornographic experience of destruction, and we like to imagine the end as a kind of escapism. I do want to say, though, I think that that question is, if I were to reflect on it more deeply, that part of, I think, a lot of my interest in worlding has to do with the sort of a recognition of the delicate place of our particular technological reality, the technic world that we live in, and that it's so technology. I believe like Carl Sagan and Donna Haraway, when they talk about we are in a technological adolescence. Like we actually don't know how to use the internet. Like we think we do. Like we think we're really good at it, but it's this enormous, all of the knowledge of human history, right, at your fingertips. We don't know how to use it. And that's how we get QAnon and how things get sort of, anyway, so that to survive our technological adolescence, I think is we have to reflect very deeply on the places where these tools, which have, the inventor of the internet thought it was too important of a tool to make money off of it, so he donated it. Anyway, I think one of the things we have to do is reflect upon those worlds where things are not how we want them to be, because that's one of the ways we know what we need to change, I think. For catharsis, though, I think, yeah, I just can go to Netflix to see those narratives.
Yeah, there's so many ways to get that kind of that weird catharsis. I would say I don't find myself personally seeking out or creating, like purposely creating or participating in those kinds of like problem worlds. Yeah, again, because we're already in it. Like I feel like a lot of the work that I do is for better or worse, is kind of coming from this place of wanting the world to be better. But of course, I have to consider what's my idea of what's better. What does that mean? What does that look like? And when I kind of examine those things really critically and carefully, my intentions, my ideas of what a better world is, or of what a better state of the field of textiles and fibers is, what things need to change. When I take a close look at myself, and really the ways that I'm embedded in these systems, the ways that I benefit from them, the ways that my work, without my even realizing it, sometimes runs through these channels that have the capacity to do harm or to exclude, then I find some of those things. And it's not catharsis, but it's this, it's a process of taking responsibility for, so it's different than what the question is asked. It's like, it's not, purposely seeking out or creating something for, that's maybe messy for the sake of catharsis, but that in the process of pursuing worlding from a sort of very sincere standpoint, that I find myself in those kind of messy spaces, that it's just part of the process, and that part of the skill is in learning how to deal with those messy situations that I find myself in, or things that I just can't ignore about, so maybe I'm critical about a particular way that textiles are studied in other places in the world, but then, I'm embedded in that too, so I think I'm starting to ramble a little bit, but it's something I feel really, it feels really urgent and interesting to kind of consider that, and that there isn't necessarily a catharsis when I have those realizations, but there is something, I hate to use the word productive, but there's something that can grow, that like that's a fertile space. So not exactly an answer to the question, but a sideways answer. Yes, in the red. Want to try and recap that for the online folks?
Yes. In what ways, as academics embedded in institution, are we provoking urgency amongst our own students to demand better circumstance, better world circumstance to emerge into as artists?
Mhm.
No. Sure, sure, sure.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, good
It-
one,
I think that if I may,
please.
in the studio setting, that something I was very lucky to experience as a student, and I continuously try and echo back to my own students is sort of um, being met as a complete world as a student is not something that happens all the time. It's actually very rare that teachers are like, oh, you are not just sort of like in my classroom and you disappear and don't exist elsewhere, that there's a whole set of causes and conditions and circumstance. And to try and meet that, I think, number one, uh, produces an acknowledgement of mutual worlding, right? That we're both trying to do this co-creation together. And maybe it's just a Venn diagram, it'll only ever touch slightly. But I think that acknowledgement creates a kind of, if urgency can be slow, or if it can occupy a whole life, to reflect that back to their students potentially, or whomever they mentor in the future. But it's like everyone has such different needs. Another way to put it is people have such different needs, I think, as students. And for some, I think when some students are demanding, like, I want to know how hand weaving relates to the economy, on a global scale, on a local scale, how I can affect change in labor rights, and how I can be a more sustainable consumer. That there is that kind of mind and desire in some students. Others are sort of like, wow, color and texture is profound. And those people can sit right next to each other in the classroom, right? And so these are both worlds that are legitimate and full and need to be cultivated differently. So I think, again, it's sort of like there is a way that through meeting each other, a kind of urgency that is in the quality, like the quality of how we meet each other as worlds is something we can do for any person we encounter. And I think that is one way artists, or at least, I hope is one way that artists can engage each other,
That was so wonderful. Yeah, I mean, in very real ways, as an educator, being an educator during the pandemic has been a completely different experience than pre-pandemic. And I think I'm not alone in finding that this shared sort of experience of crisis, of vast shift of the kind of floor coming out from underneath us all, having to be isolated. So really feeling, myself and knowing that my students are feeling this kind of their sort of singular worldness in a very intense way. That experience has opened so many more possibilities just for me as an educator, of empathy, of really seeing each of my students as a world. Like you said, I just love that, you know, like that each person is a world that's kind of in tangency with and in relationship with all the other worlds that we each inhabit and create. But thinking about this question for me is interesting because I am not teaching studio art classes right now. I teach the largest lecture classes in the art department at the University of Oregon. I teach the 2 introductory lecture classes about contemporary art. So I have 215 students in my classes, and they were really, you know, not a very personalized model of teaching, even before the pandemic when I went asynchronous and online. So there's something that happened in that shift that I made a couple of years ago into teaching this kind of class that has been so productive for me, because in some ways, for all that I am like one human in this, what feels like a sea of students, most of whom have never studied art. So they're coming to art as completely new, open worlds of their own. But when you are in a position of responsibility and care for the education of so many humans at once, there is no way to avoid crises. You know, students, you all of us have crises, have like mental health situations, have illness, have lose family members and friends. And so what I've been surprised by in my own process of learning to teach art in this way is that it has in some ways radically expanded my capacity for empathy and ability to kind of meet students where they're at, which I did not expect going into that, you know, this kind of classroom. But yeah, sometimes all it takes is just to acknowledge that someone is experiencing something worthy of attention and care, and to say, yeah, I hear you, I see you, I understand why this is a struggle, and let's figure out a way to deal with it so you can continue to learn. You know, sometimes that's all that, like, that is one of the most impactful things that students can experience. The other thing I want to say about your question is that in the context of teaching a lecture class, part of what's important is what is represented to students. So I think a lot about representation, and that is another way of thinking about world building is what are people exposed to? What's being shared with them? What am I providing? And so a lot of how I deal with many of the things that you listed in your question is to try to make sure I have this sort of utopian goal that like every student in my class will see or experience something that they connect to from their own embedded, personal world experience at least once in the class. So yeah, those are other ways that as educators, we can really be thinking about and acknowledging and respecting, caring for the needs of students in all their diversity. Yeah, good question. Are we at time? Well, we had one more question. Is it okay? Because you've been waiting so patiently. Yeah, so the question is kind of a reflection on our relationships as educators, as artists, as beings in the world, to really considering the ancestors, and how my mind's already starting to go. I'm trying to recap your question, and I'm already moving forward. But yeah, I think, your question is really like
how to make these
wh-
new worlds
with
while acknowledging
acknowledging the ancestors. Yeah. Go ahead. There's a lot going on in here.
Yeah, I
need
think that
a minute.
we have sort of like technology. We think we understand time. Like we think we know how to use the internet. Like we think we understand time because it's like, oh yeah, it's now 7:37. I'm gonna have dinner now, and then tomorrow the next thing. I think that worlding demands even that we question our assumptions about how we exist in history and in time, right? So I think that this is very important, to begin to think of ourselves in relationship to ancestors means that they live like next to me, and that future generations also exist in direct relationship to this. So I think that when I remember at some point in I was reading this book called Basin and Range by Jonathan McPhee, kind of an interesting study of geology. One way that we something we need to practice is seeing ourselves in relationship to vastness, right? We are forced by so many forces to be very small and to exist in like 2021. It's almost Halloween. I'm gonna go party. This sort of like smallness of time, which is great. We exist there as well, but we also exist as enormous beings that touch many, many other lives simultaneously. And I just simply have chosen to believe that, I think, and there's no sort of trick to it. And I think through art, amazingly through textile, through weaving, like when you pass a shuttle over warp and weft, or when you sew, you're in direct relationship, physical relationship to those people who have done that before throughout time and space. So it doesn't need to be invented, it sort of just needs to be acknowledged, I think.
Yeah, and I also feel that in the same way that we are all sort of particle sharing with like every, I think of Carl, you invoked Carl Sagan earlier, that we are all made of billions and billions of particles of star stuff, or whatever his wonderful nerdy, little treatises. But it is true that I feel it is true that, yes, as anyone who is a part of making, which, always implies, something is in a state of becoming, that you can't become from nothing. So yeah, everything, that we build, that we imagine, that we desire, comes from our embeddedness in not only the current moment, but of course everyone and everything that has come before, and that a depth of respect and care and generosity in those relationships is deeply essential for a process of worlding that may actually, bear some fruit. Yeah, and I mean, I think about the idea of the gift. I've read, and I'm blanking out, is it Lewis Hyde? I can't remember his name, who wrote this book called The Gift, and many other people have have kind of written about and thought about this idea of keeping a gift in motion. You know, I also think about Robin Wall Kimmerer's writing about, you know, the understanding from her own Indigenous ancestry that every being has a gift, and that it is every being's responsibility to share that gift with the world. And a gift can be a bird's ability to sing. A gift can be your ability to weave on the TC2 loom, or to speak, to share with language. But that what is so essential about gifts, and gifts are so often passed on to us from our ancestors, right? Those that we're in direct lineage with, and those that maybe we're not, that, you know, that are still kind of part of that, like I was saying, that sort of particulate matter, that soup that we all swim in. But that what's so important is that we keep those gifts in motion. And so what's been given to us, what we've received, what we've learned, is something that is very not static, and it's necessary to kind of keep that emotion, and that moves through the ages and goes on to those who come after us, like you were saying. So yeah, keeping the gift in motion. Thank you. Such lovely questions. Should we wrap this?
That's our pep talk, I think.
Yes, keep the gift in motion, of course.
So the online community can hear me. I just want to thank both of you for coming and spending time with us and sharing the conversation, and the focus of your work and vision of kind of where you're going and what you're interested in the future. Those of you online, those of you in here, there's a really, really robust programming from Portland Textile Month. Jovencio and Sonya are involved in a lot of it alongside of other people within the region. Textilex.org, you can kind of find that extra programming. And then every Wednesday night, or not every Wednesday night, but on Wednesday nights, we have lecture series, and the mailing and information is all on the PNCA website. So we invite you to come along with us. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you.